Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's good to be together. My name is Ellen Burge, Pedagogical Advisor to English Programs for MLF America. It is my pleasure to introduce Pedro De Bruyckere, educational scientist and teacher trainer from Ghent, Belgium. Pedro wrote his PhD on authenticity in education, and he has co-authored multiple books, including the popular Urban Myths About Learning and Education. Pedro's specialty is translating the newest scientific insights into practical application. And at this moment in time, a time of crisis around the world, we are so fortunate to have Pedro with us today to speak specifically on activating resilience and motivation in our children. Resilience and motivation are both topics addressed in his forthcoming book, The Psychology of Great Teaching. Almost everything you need to know about psychology for children and youngsters. We very much look forward to the release of that book, but in the meantime, I give you Pedro De Bruyckere. Pedro?
Thank you very much. Bonjour, hello, hola, gegroet. Je me sais débrouiller en français, mais pas assez pour donner ma présentation dans la langue de Voltaire, donc excusez-moi, mais je sais qu'il y aura une très bonne traduction. If you don't think my English is that good and you want to hear me in French, just push on the globe with interpretation in the bottom of the app, and you can choose a Spanish version and a French-speaking version. By the way, yes, my name is Pedro, but I can't speak Spanish. I tried, but sorry. The only reason my name is Pedro is because my grandmother really liked a Spanish actor. That's the only reason. Okay, so my name is Pedro De Bruyckere. I wrote a lot of books, urban myths about learning and education, and more urban myths about learning and education. And in July, this book will be published, The Psychology of Great Teaching. But today, I want to discuss resilience and motivations in students, for students during pandemic learning, but also after the pandemic, because I hope one day it will be over. But I will start discussing motivation first, and I'll end with resilience. But between motivation and resilience, I need a bridge, and that bridge will be self-regulation. It will be fun. There will be room for questions, but first I will have a talk of 45 minutes with some smiles, some jokes, but also with a lot of up-to-date information. I hope you're ready. Let's go. First of all, let's start with motivation. And I will discuss three things concerning motivation. There are two ideas. They are very popular, but they are way too simplistic, so I need to debunk them. Then I'll give you an oversight of the 5 most popular theories on motivation in children, but also with adults. And then I'll pick one, the self-determination theory, to discuss and to also explain how it's often misunderstood. Now, let's start off with 3 times too simplistic, so it's incorrect. Number 1, too simplistic. Number 1, well-being leads to learning. It's a very popular idea that you need to feel good to learn something. Yeah, but I can feel so good that I think by myself, you know what? Let's do nothing. Let's postpone everything I need to do because I feel great. Actually, if you look at research, learning leads more often to well-being than vice versa. Oh, this doesn't mean that all types of learning or all learning situations can make you feel good. But maybe you recognize this, that you have a kind of aha-erlebnis. Now I know it, now I understand, and that makes you more motivated. It makes you feel great. But if your partner leaves you, maybe you learn also something, but it doesn't mean that you feel that great at that moment. It's even more complicated because if there is too much stress, what we call toxic stress, then there will be no learning at all. And this has been a very important theme for the past 2 years, because we've seen around the globe take Uganda, where the children have been out of school for 2 years, then we know that there is a lot of stress. I've been following all the research on school closures and the pandemic, and we've seen that a lot of children have had issues at home, for instance, where parents are abusing children more, for instance, delivering more stress, and then no learning will occur. So it's complicated. A very recent review study summarizes it like this. I do warn you, it's a very complicated slide. I'll blow it up for you as you can see it, but I'll explain in a second. This is the slide. And what you see here is that motivation has an impact on achievement, but again, achievement has an impact on motivation. The most important elements of this slide is the gray arrows, because the gray arrows are those elements that you can have an impact on. For instance, the culture, the support of autonomy, this can have a huge impact on the motivation, but also the outside pressure. We know that parents who put a lot of pressure on their children so they can perform, the irony is we know from research on average, those children will perform less good. You need to find the right balance. So the gray arrows are those elements you can have an influence on. For instance, the quality of instruction has a huge impact on the achievement. It has a huge impact on the quantity and for sure the quality of learning. But by doing this, it also has a huge influence on the motivation. Okay. That was the first thing you need to know. Too simplistic. Number one, it's not that learning and well-being are a very simple causal relation. Too simplistic. Number two, intrinsic motivation is good. Extrinsic motivation is bad. Actually, there is much more than intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. How much more? Well, this is the overview. I'll explain it in a second, but it's much bigger than what you thought. But I have first a very simple question, and you can answer in your own language just by saying yes or no in the chat, so I can see that you're alive out there. Are you intrinsic motivated for every single thing you do? Just say yes or no. Now, that's a very easy question. I've got good news, except for the one person who said yes. You all seem very normal. And the one person who said yes, I really want to meet you. Now, if we go back to the story here, if you look at motivation, we go from amotivation, that's a situation where a child has no motivation at all, to intrinsic motivation, but there are many steps between them. And if you look at those steps, the basis for this difference, the different kinds of motivation, are different kinds of pressure. Let me explain this. The first one is external regulation. And this is what you will recognize as typical extrinsic motivation. It is based on punishments and rewards. It's, in fact, operant conditioning from behaviorism. And children or young people at school are motivated by the awarding of good grades, that's a reward, or by the desire to avoid detention, which is punishment. In other words, their behavior is driven or regulated by external expectations. Is this a good thing? Well, sometimes yes. Actually, if you want to change behavior, this can be a good way, but from the moment on learning and cognition is involved, it has a negative effect. So you can use it, but you can use it to a very limited amount of situations. A second one is more complicated. It's introjected regulation. It's a second type of extrinsic motivation for which the pressure can also come from outside source, but it's not really an outside source. Let me explain this. For example, children and young people who are setting the bar very high for themselves because they don't want to look foolish for their peers. In this case, they don't know if those peers will think they are dumb or whatever, but in their minds, they feel the pressure. They don't want to look good or bad for others. In this case, the pressure comes from outside, but it's also a bit inside. Okay. Now I have a very simple question. Again, you can answer yes or no in the chat. Who is intrinsic motivated to put the trash out every single week? Just answer yes or no. Are you motivated to put the trash out? Intrinsic motivated. Okay, some people are, but most of you again said no. And Christian says, oh, Amelie, no. Okay, I understand you. I feel you. Actually, I have to do it right after this talk, and I'm not looking forward to it. But we do it. Why do we do it? Because we think it's important to have a clean house. And we know to achieve a clean house, we need to put the trash out. It's that simple. Now, this kind of motivation is called identified regulation. And what is this? Well, why do we do it? Because we want to achieve a different goal. We know this is a kind of stepping stone to achieve something else. And this is not intrinsic motivation. For instance, I want to become a doctor. I know as a student or as a pupil, I need mathematics to become a doctor. But I don't like mathematics, but I will do my best to achieve great points, great grades for mathematics, because I know I need it for something else. So the something else, to become a doctor, I'm intrinsic motivated for that. But I'm extrinsic motivated for mathematics to achieve another goal. But for me, that's a good thing. This is called identified regulation. And that's the reason why it's so important when discussing education with children, with young people, is to explain why they need to learn it. Because sometimes they don't see why they need it. And sometimes they don't see it as a stepping stone. They just see something that they need to study, but they don't know at all why. I'm a teacher trainer myself, and I'm visiting a lot of schools and sit in the back of classes to observe students and teachers. And how many times I've heard asking a child or a teenager, why do I need to know this? If you can't answer this question, well, it's very hard to get them motivated, actually. So identified regulation, for me, it's a perfect extrinsic motivation. And if your child, if you're a parent, or if your students are identified, regulated, motivated, that's fine with me. And of course, then you have the big one, intrinsic motivation. So now you see how there are different steps. It's more than extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. I have a third, too simplistic. Number 3, being more motivated is better. And I will surprise you now. The worst advice you can ever give to anybody is follow your passion. Never say this again to anybody, because it's a bad piece of advice. What's the good version of the advice? The good version of the advice is follow your passion, but have something on the side. I have to explain why. If you only follow one passion, whenever there is a hurdle or a setback, there's a bigger chance you will quit because you don't have resilience. We see that people who are extremely passionate for one thing and one thing only, there is a smaller chance they will succeed. So if somebody wants to become the best fence player in the world, okay, that's a good thing, go for it, but also have a hobby on the side, have room for something else, because whenever there's a setback, then you have a place to get by. Then you have a place where you can have some room to compensate. So it's not being more motivated is better, because sometimes you can be so motivated that if you are so passionate, but you only have one passion, there's a bigger chance you won't succeed. Okay, 3 times too simplistic, now 5 theories. At this time, in a lot of countries, a lot of people, when they are discussing motivation, for sure in education, they will discuss the self-determination theory from DC and Ryan. I will discuss this theory also in a minute, but you need to know that there are 4 other theories: the expectancy value theory, the attribution theory, the goal orientation theory, and the social cognitive theories, who are also very important and popular. Now, I could discuss them all, but then I need a couple of hours more and it would be very boring. But I have something better. What do those 5 group of theories have in common? And then you see that in all the important theories about motivation, there are the same elements coming again and again. So it's more interesting to look at the common elements, because all theories agree those elements are important. The very first one is competence or feasibility. Well, what's this? It's the way that a challenge is perceived as being able to succeed, to complete it successfully, can influence the motivation of the learner. If a task seems too easy, they won't be motivated. If a task seems too difficult, a child won't be motivated. Now, it's very important. It's about perception. If a child thinks it's too difficult, it will stop. Even if you know as a teacher or as a parent, you can do this. Maybe then it's a good idea to slice the task in smaller parts where the child sees, yeah, I know, I can do this. Let's try this. Now, it's all about experience, and it's also connected to what I showed you a couple of minutes ago, how achievement can influence motivation. A second element is the value. How important is the activity for the child or the teenager, for the learner? If the child or the learner or the pupil, the student, is experiencing the task as useful, beneficial, interesting, or good for the self-image, remember, how do I look for others, or the reputation, or will it make the child happy, satisfied? That is a good thing. But if there is a chance that he or she will lose her face, or that he or she is afraid for failing, or he or she thinks it's worthless, no value at all, you won't be motivated. The child won't be motivated. Again, it's connected to why are we doing this? The why in the story. Number 3, what all those theories have in common is the element of control. How much control does the learner have over the different component elements of the task? A learner will perform much better if he or she is convinced that his or her effort can influence the successful implementation of the task. He or she can make a difference, but he or she is also in charge of certain elements. A fourth element, and this will maybe surprise you, is that all theories, except that cognitive processes influence motivation and not feelings or emotions, at least not at first. So it always starts with a cognitive analysis, and that's good news because it means we can have an influence. And the last element that they all have in common is social aspects. No surprise here. Motivation is strongly influenced by the interactions of learners, children, teenagers, but also adults with others. Not only in the past, but also during the task, and also with an eye on the future in the effects of how I will look, for instance. Okay, and if we look then at those different elements, all those elements return in what we call the self-determination theory by Deci and Ryan. And in this theory, we see 3 elements. We see autonomy, that's the element of control. We see belonging, that's the relationship with the teacher, but also with the others, and the element of competence. Now, for me, competence, I've explained it a couple of times, but this is something that also was under pressure during lockdowns or during of online learning, because what have our children, our students, and we as parents or our teachers have heard over and over again, there is a learning loss because of school closures. Yes, we had online courses, but they are not that good. What a lot, that doesn't need to be true, but often it was the case. But what have children heard over and over again? That there is a learning loss, that they are less competent, and this can be a very important reason why they feel less motivated. So it's very important to show children, even if there are online classes, that they've learned something, to show them their competence. But of those three elements, there is one very often misunderstood, and that is autonomy. Autonomy is not a synonym for freedom. Actually, if you give a child, a student, even an adult, complete freedom, well, then they will, a lot of them will become paralyzed because they don't know what to do. What is autonomy? Autonomy is having options within boundaries. So it's very important to know, if you are working with young people, with children, and you want to keep them motivated, you also need to introduce boundaries. In kindergarten around the globe, they are actually working on this, because you can have different corners where they can work in the corner, and that is learning how to choose. They have autonomy. They can choose a corner where they can play with Play-Doh or will draw or read something, but it's only limited to those different options. And this is more motivating than saying to a child, do whatever you want, because at that moment they will think, what do they want me to do? Okay, good. Let's go to self-regulation, and we're halfway our story, so it's time for a bit of fun. I want to show you a small video, and I'll explain afterwards why I show you this. Have a look.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something, and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
So it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. So I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did? You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you I'd give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
Okay. This is the very famous marshmallow test by Walter Mischel. But wait, it's more serious than you might think, because years later, the original study happened in the 60s and 70s of last century, but they found out that years later that they still had the addresses of the original pupils, the original respondents in the test. So they looked them up and they found that delayed gratification correlates. It's important, correlates. It's not a causal relation, but correlates with higher competence. It was an American study. It correlated with higher SAT scores. It correlated with their body mass index. Well, same logic. And even with how a person smells. No, that's a joke. Just kidding. Yeah? But it correlated with a lot. A fair warning, don't try this at home. Okay, don't try this at home, because we know that there were all students, children, actually, from parents who worked at universities. So there is a bias in the test people being used. But it led to what we call executive functions. And executive functions are a huge element nowadays when you are discussing education. And if you want a very short explanation what executive functions are, it's the control room in our head. It's what helps us to focus. It's what helps us to pay attention. It's what helps us plan stuff. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what is or not is executive function. The basic ingredients are inhibitory control, working memory, mental flexibility. There are a lot of other lists, but those three elements often return. But then comes a very important question, because this is the bridge between motivation and resilience. And why I'm discussing this is, can we have an influence on those elements, inhibitory control, working memory, but also mental flexibility? For instance, if something seems too complicated, can I change? Can I have the mental flexibility to change myself so it doesn't seem too difficult, so I will become more motivated? Well, that's a good question. I do know some tricks to make executive functions worse, also called the nurture. For instance, inhibitory control and beer, that's not a good idea. I won't explain it, you know what I mean. But also working memory and being tired, being really, really, really tired is not such a good idea. But also, and now you see the link with what I said in the beginning, noise, but also toxic stress can have a very negative effect on, for instance, the working memory, on learning. And that's, a lot of schools nowadays have a dilemma. Should we invest time on the learning because there's a learning loss, or should we invest time on the well-being of children? Now, the good news is, by focusing on the learning, we can also achieve well-being. But if the child is too stressed out, when the well-being is missing completely, then you first need to address this, because otherwise learning won't happen, like I explained, but it's related to those executive functions and the working memory. But then is the question, can you make executive functions better? I'll start off with the bad news. The bad news is that this is a review study from 2015, but I can show you another study from 2019 with exactly the same result. 25 years worth of research finds no conclusive evidence that developing students' executive function skills leads to better academic performance. Still, if you look at short-term effects, then there is clear evidence you can do things to make it better. So you can help children, students, in a short time to have better attention span, to have a better planning possibilities or planning skills. And based on this report from Harvard, a couple of suggestions, things you can do to help children, students to be better in their executive functions. For instance, goal setting, planning, and monitoring. Having a clear objective, a clear goal is something you can help them with. And if you help them with this, but you also support them in the monitoring, then you are working on their executive functions. And this will last for a small time, but it will help. Working on study skills, very important. But again, then you need to give them tools for self-monitoring. But something that you won't... Oh, okay. I thought I heard somebody. But also, activities such as sport, music, dance can help. Quite often when we are discussing things like culture in education, quite often it's something that we ask ourselves, is it really needed? The answer is yes. Because imagine how much you ask from the executive functions in the head of a child when you ask them to dance together. They need to follow the others. They need to have control about their body, of their bodies. It's key to have all those executive functions in place to be able to dance, but also to sports, even board games, building empathy with other children, trying to have strategic insight what to do so you can win. It all helps. Now, I needed this to go to resilience. Now, resilience is a very important theme, and both motivation and those executive functions and self-regulation that's related to it will come back in a minute. But first, what is resilience? Well, I first need to discuss what isn't resilience. It's not never being sad. It doesn't mean that if you're resilient that you can't feel sad or can't feel emotional. It doesn't mean that you're never being hurt. If there's never sadness with a child, then there's a big chance the child is depressed because you need to have emotions. No, what is resilience? Resilience consists of 4 elements. The first element is self-awareness. Self-awareness allows you to recognize your own emotions whilst also providing you with a clear self-image and hopefully sufficient self-esteem, as well as the ability to reflect on these things. So that's a very first important first element. A second element is self-management. Self-management provides you with all the self-discipline you need to express emotions appropriately and to set and follow up objectives, to show an initiative and to work independently. For instance, if you are talking about self-awareness, if a child says, oh, maybe I was a bit too angry yesterday. Maybe I exaggerated a bit when I reacted yesterday. That's a good thing because it shows that this person, this child, this teenager recognize their own emotions and also know maybe it's not a good thing. So they have developing self-awareness, but they also are developing, oh, maybe it was too much, a self-management. The third element, well, then the other comes into the picture. Social awareness. And what is social awareness? Well, social awareness provides you with a degree of empathy. And now you see the link with the executive functions, because empathy is one of the executive functions. That's why I said how playing board games, for instance, can help. Social awareness allows you to recognize and appreciate the perspectives of others, but also to contribute, to help others. and also to understand relationships. And the fourth element is a step further. Then we have social management. And social management allows you to communicate, collaborate, take decisions, maybe arbitrate conflicts even, reach solutions, and even play maybe a leadership role when needed. Now, this is a very big thing to achieve. And now I have good news and bad news. The bad news is, in part, this is nature. This is nature. Some people, some children, some teenagers, some adults are better at it by design. But the good news is that we also can teach this in part. It's also in part nurture. And then is the question, how? Well, the good news is, and this will be the most practical part of my talk, how can you build resilience? First of all, the collective. There is an old saying, African saying, that you need a village to raise a child, and this is true. The more the people surrounding the child are in the same line, in the same vein of thinking, when they have the same convictions on how you can achieve the best thing for the child, the bigger the chance that the child will become more resilient. For the people who are really interested in this, also look at the theory of Ulrich Bronfenbrenner, who wrote a lot about this. But also the best friend forever. Having a good friend can work wonders for a child or for a young person's resilience. For instance, a British study, amongst many others, has confirmed that youngsters who have genuine and qualitative bonds of friendship with an age peer find it easier to deal with difficult situations and crises. This is also important if you know that a child that you're working with, for instance, or if your own son or daughter are having a very hard time, try to make it possible that the best friend is in reach. For instance, here in Belgium, during the lockdown, we had a period that families were only allowed to allow one person a week to visit. Well, let this be then this best friend if this child, your son or your daughter, is having it really, really difficult. But also it can be an adult you can trust. And this is something that I want to share with all the teachers and also all the supporting personnel of schools who are watching this. Because quite often you can have in schools, for instance, the man or the lady, the woman who is giving out milk in school, for instance, or food. Some students or pupils will have a bond with that person because it's a person they trust, they have a little talk with it, and it can be kind of crutch to lean on so you can have a better feeling. And be aware that everybody in school can be that adult, a child, a pupil can trust. Those people are important. But also a possibility is to become a member of a club. It's not the same as the collective, but we know that if a child becomes a member of a sporting club or an art club or whatever club, maybe even just cycling to school with a group of fellow students, it will help. It will help to work on that social awareness, but also that social management. And also, if you don't know which club a child should pick, well, first of all, okay, very important is the element of a language course they follow together. But if they need another club, go for a sporting club. This sounds a sports club or a sporting club. Why? Because we have been stating for, well, millennia, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy body in a healthy mind, and it's true. The saying has existed since ancient times, but it has a very important core of truth. Keeping your body fit and healthy can help you to deal with setbacks. In a lot of Hollywood movies and series, whenever a child or a teenager or an adult has a setback, they take a big chunk of ice cream and start eating. The truth is, after eating all that ice cream, you will feel much worse. What have been saying psychologists around the globe during this crisis, go out and have a walk, go out and cycle, go out and have some sport, do some sport, because we know a healthy body and a healthy mind. Now, this sounds logical, this sounds good, but maybe a bit too big. Well, let's look at some smaller things you can do. A very important thing is we need to teach our children to set realistic objectives. Why is this? Having objectives in your life helps you to look forward. And this is what you need in times of sadness, times of hardship. And by looking forward to the future rather than remaining trapped in the present and the past, it can be a great help to children and young people if you teach them how to set and to follow up realistic goals. But the very important word here is realistic. Because if you have unrealistic goals, if you do this in 3 months' time, you will achieve this. 3 months is eternity. Unrealistic goals can actually have a negative effect on resilience, as can having a passion that is all too consuming, remember? But if you can teach children to look forward, what can I achieve today? What can I achieve tomorrow? You know what? I tried this and it worked. That can help to build resilience. But it's not only important that you give them those objectives, but it's important for them to learn to set those realistic objectives themselves. Another one is learn young people, children, to recognize fallacies. And we all make them, but maybe you recognize this one. A teenager, and I have to say, it's not something my children have had to endure. They asked me to say it wasn't them in this example, okay? But a hypothetical child has for the very first time feel depressed because he or she asked somebody, can you be my date? And he or she said no. And you hear this person, this child, this young person say, never has anybody felt as bad as me. And you know, that's not true. A lot of people have felt it. But don't say this. We know it's a fallacy. We know that if a child says everything in the world is wrong, that's not the case. And we need to teach them it's a fallacy, but you can't do this by saying you're wrong, because then the conversation stops. It's much better first to start listening. Why do you feel like this? And maybe an extra tip, next time when you are in such a situation, instead of sitting face to face, sit beside each other, because it's much less frightening to discuss difficult themes while sitting next to each other. That's why in a car or when you are doing the dishes, it's much easier to have a difficult conversation, because if you look in the eyes and say, what's wrong? Nothing. Now, you start listening. It's something that we often forget to do. Quite often we want to give a solution, while the young person sitting next to you just want to be heard. And you listen to it and you agree and you nod. And then you feel the right moment to say, yeah, you said a couple of minutes ago or 10 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago that everything is wrong, or you can't do anything right. But yesterday I saw you smile. Why was this? And so you introduce another perspective. And by doing this, you teach them to recognize such fallacies. But trust me, it takes time. And maybe the most important thing we need to teach our children is we need to teach them to dare to seek help. It's perhaps one of the most important lessons that a child or young person needs to learn. Now, once again, this is something where your friends and the people around you can play an important role. In education, for instance, from education, remember, there is sometimes a reference to the zero line. in the number of helplines that are available to a pupil. Instead of saying only, if there is a problem, come to me, next time add something. If you are worried about one of your classroom mates, if you are worried about one of your friends, you can also come to me, because quite often children know much better than you as a teacher, but also maybe as a parent, what's wrong. So tell them that if there's something wrong, or if they are worried, they think they are not sure that something is wrong, that they also can come to you. Maybe you can have more support for everybody. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this has been less than 1/20th of this book that will come out in July, and I made it very brief. So see you next time. Thank you. Okay. Hi, Alan. I can't hear you.
Pedro, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, of course. Really, yeah.
And in the chat would be fine, I guess, or the Q&A. If anyone has a question that you'd like to pose to Pedro.
I'm all yours.
Thank you. Wonderful.
A lot of people are saying thanks. That's great. But if you have any criticism, feel free, because I like to react, of course. Oh, that's a very interesting question from Marie-Pierre Carlotti.
Yes, correct.
How would you teach resilience against racism? It's a very interesting question, but I have to think about it. Now, what we know is that when discussing racism, but also acceptance, the opposite of racism in this case, that there are several elements playing a role. First of all, resilience, understanding the perspective and also the wrong perspective, that some people have a wrong perspective for different reasons. Can you make you more resilient? You still will feel hurt, but still you can see it, understand it a bit. But also we know that if we look at research, it's actually research done nearby here, that by meeting each other, learn to know each other, is one of the best ways to fight racism. But an important element in this is having enough use of the same language to understand each other. Because if only people meet each other, but they talk with each other, but they don't understand the words because they mean something different with different words, it can be actually counterproductive. So it's very important to have guidance where you can check if when you put different children together, where the one is more racist against the other, that they have the same understanding. But meeting each other is a starting point. Okay.
Pedro, we have a couple more questions.
Perfect.
Leticia asks, how can we take them out of their screens, away from their screens, their phone, video games, and engage them in things like board games and things that would build more empathy, self-regulation, and some of the other things you talked about?
Okay, first of all, routines and clear rules help. It's very important if you are in a situation, even during lockdown, where a child is stuck at home, then building a kind of structure in your home situation, but also in the weekends or during holidays, where you say, okay, this is the moment you can be on your phone and you can do this, but there are other moments you need to do something else. That's a starting point, because otherwise you're in for an impossible task. And investing this kind of a structure can be very hard after 2 years, for instance. But a way to do this is by being a good model, because it's impossible to tell your children they can't be on their phones all of the time if you are on your phone during meals yourself, for instance. But also you can try a kind of trade-off. you can say, let's do an experiment. Let's try something by going out on a walk and see what the effect will be if we do this for the next couple of days. Will you have a better sleep? Will you have a better feeling? And by doing this, you introduce it as a kind of experiment. You lure them into it a bit, but it's a starting point. Another way is using that extrinsic motivation with punishment, but and rewards. But I think this is a more adult way to try it first.
Pedro, we're getting several questions now. We may not be able to hit them all, but I'll feed you a few more if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yasmin asks, isn't there a risk to make kids too resilient or passive in the time of COVID where they should apply rules without asking questions?
Well, that's almost a philosophical question, because asking questions is always important, and understanding why something is happening is always a better motivator than just being told what to do. And for sure, with certain teenagers, then they want to do the opposite by definition. And what we've seen from a lot of research around the globe, quite often we saw in the media a kind of generation conflict between young people who are being locked up to save the older ones, the older people, but those older people were the grandparents of those young people. And if you ask children, do you want to do this for your grandparents? Most of the time they said yes. So I think that it's very important that children keep asking questions, but we also need to answer them.
Ramona asks, her question is regarding empathy and social skills, particularly during this time of COVID, like with kids having less opportunities to play team sports and students being confined for long periods of time, learning online. Is it possible for them to regain some of their resilience and some of their social skills?
The good news is yes. What we've seen from several studies in regions where lockdowns were much shorter, then coming back to normal for a lot of children work like a charm. But I said for a lot of children, not for all of them. And it's very important to have a clear view, observe all children, all the young people you're working with, because some of them won't be so lucky and they need extra support. So the good news is most of them will be fine, but some of them, no. Can I give an example? We've seen for the past 2 years that, for instance, there are much more children and young people who have anorexia, who have eating disorders. That's a real big problem, a big issue. A lot of people have inside a kind of sensitive element to become anorexic, but most of the people don't. But what we've seen during the stressful period, that a lot of young people go too far in it and become a patient with an eating disorder. That's something you can't come back from by yourself. So this is something we need to observe. And this is one example, but we see the same thing with anxiety disorders, for instance, that are also on the rise. So we need to have a clear focus that we still keep observing everybody to see who needs help.
Pedro, maybe a final question.
Okay.
What would your recommendations be in regards to teaching students and our children time management?
I think you can't start young enough. It's something you need to start early on. It's something that in the different classes should return, because we know it's very difficult to teach something like this. This is a metacognitive element, and how to teach a child or a young person metacognition, planning and things like that is when all teachers involved are using the same language, the same techniques, and refer to each other, then there is a chance it will happen. But giving them A separate class on time management doesn't work because then it's something they, no. But if it comes back over and over again and everybody refers to each other, we call this the theory of identical elements, then there is a big possibility it will happen.